All right, so we are starting a class called Sticky Faith. Has anybody read the book called Sticky Faith? It is a book, and it's kind of going to be our guide. If you like to read, or you want to, even if you don't like to read, this is probably definitely top 3 books over youth ministry that I've ever read. And so anyways, if you're a reader, I would definitely recommend this book. We've got a sign-up list going around. I can get them for $10. I think they're the regular $15, but I can get them for $10. So if you want one, sign up on that list, and I could probably have those here on Wednesday via Amazon Prime. Don't feel like you have to get one, but if you want one, it'll kind of give you kind of a better idea of what we're trying to accomplish over this. Essentially, Sticky Faith is a book. It's got a lot of research and a lot of practical ideas, but essentially the whole idea is we want to develop, parents want to develop, youth ministers want to develop a faith in teenagers that sticks. And we're going to get into some of these numbers here in a little while, and there'll be a lot of numbers we'll talk about over the course of this study. And I'll say this right now, I'll probably say it again. We don't need to get too hung up on numbers. You know, I know a lot of times when you go somewhere, you look, how many do they have on Sunday morning? How many do they have in Bible class? How many do they have in the PM service? That is not I think the story that God wants us to focus on. But I do think numbers tell a story. If you've got 2,000 people worshiping together on a Sunday morning and you've got 7 coming back on Sunday night, that tells a story. I don't necessarily know what story that is, but that tells a story. If we've got 80 kids that are showing up for bowling, and then we've got 2 that are showing up for Devo, that tells a story, right? Obviously, we need to have all the details before we start determining what that story is. But I do want to say that numbers are not the most important thing. Numbers are not the end all. But we will talk about some numbers over the course of this study, and hopefully they will help us develop, a strategy or an idea of how we develop a sticky faith. If you're like me, when you're trying to hang something at your house, I always start off with what I've got, and so which usually is not very much. And so if I'm trying to hang something on the wall, instead of probably going to Lowe's or Walmart and getting the appropriate hardware, the appropriate tape that I need, I usually go and see what Katie keeps in her little corner, and usually it's like Scotch tape. Maybe we have some like painter's tape. I'm like, oh yeah, this will work, and I put it on the wall, and it works. And then I come back an hour later, and what's happened? It's fallen down, right? And so then I go to the next thing, or maybe I just put more tape on there, right? And I'm like, okay, that's good, and it sticks for a little bit while longer, and then I come back the next morning, and it's fallen down. And at that point, I'm frustrated, and I'm ticked off. I'm like, all right, this thing is never, ever coming down. The next tenants in our apartment are going to have to pry this thing off the wall, because I go to Walmart or wherever and get Gorilla Glue, and that thing is plastered on there, right? That's the kind of faith that we want our kids to have, right? We don't want our kids to have painter's tape faith. We don't want our kids to have Scotch tape faith. We want our kids to have Gorilla Glue tape faith, right? No matter what comes, if it's a storm, if it's someone pulling against it, if it's something that's trying to get them to pull away from God, we want to make sure that there's nothing that can do that, right? That's what we want for our teens. That's what I know that you want, and I hope that you know that that's what I want for your teens. That's what we're going to be talking about over this quarter, is how do we do that? How do we develop that kind of faith? And before we go any farther, I do want to say this. Faith is not a science. Faith is not a science. There's no formula that always works. There's no formula that's like, well, if you do these 3 things for your child, you're guaranteed a child to be faithful for the rest of their life. There's not that. For some of you especially, I know we got some engineers and we got some, right brain thinking people. I know you wish you could say, well, I woke up this morning, I made them read their Bible, and at lunch I know they said their prayers, and in the evening I know they studied their Bible for 30 minutes. Surely that is going to develop a faith that sticks. I make sure that they went to church camp. I make sure that they went on a mission trip. I made sure that they did this. I made sure that they did Last Leaders. I made sure that they did all these things, right? So I've completed the formula. I've completed the equation. Faith doesn't work like that. You know, I think about King Saul, right? King Saul was appointed by God, anointed by God, and he literally had someone, one of the prophets, that was there whispering in his ear anything that God wanted him to say. And God set King Saul up for success. And he had all these things that God had granted him. And he still fell away. I think about Judas, the one that portrayed Jesus. He literally ministered alongside of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the great physician. And he fell away. I know that could be very discouraging, but I do want to say that because there's not a perfect formula. All of us know people, maybe some of us have teens in here that have grown, but all of us know people who have raised kids in a godly way and it didn't stick. You know, think about so many preachers that have children that are rebellious. You know, my mom and dad, my dad's a preacher, started preaching when I was in 7th grade, and he's got 3 kids that are youth ministers, 1 that just graduated college, and 3 that have nothing to do with the church. I wasn't alive, I was alive, but I wasn't there through all the process. I don't know if there was very much difference, but I know that they have always been faithful. And so something worked and something didn't. Some kids took it, some kids didn't. I know we know this, but God gives us all free will. He gives us all the decisions, all of us the decision to choose. And that's a good thing, right? Because we want to be able to choose what we want to do. That is a gift that God has given us, but I know as a parent, sometimes that doesn't seem like very much of a gift. I know that sometimes we wish we could make our child do this and make our child do that. And some things you can make your child do, by the way. I don't want this to come across like you get to let your 12-year-old decide if they want to go to church. Personally, I don't think a 12-year-old gets the decision if they want to go to church or not. They're going to church. But when they're 23, 24, 25, 26, you don't get to make those decisions anymore. So faith is not an exact science. And even though we could do everything perfectly, there could still be that one that strays away. I think about Matthew chapter 18, verses 10 through 14. A very common parable that Jesus taught. It says, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of that one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish." You know, a shepherd doesn't want his sheep to go astray. And a shepherd could be the greatest shepherd in the world, but inevitably a sheep is going to wander away. But also notice the shepherd didn't just say, "Well, I did everything that I could. I made sure that they had quiet waters. I made sure that they had all the food that they needed. I made sure that I protected them from the big bad wolf. I did everything that they needed," right? But still, they're going to wander away. But that doesn't mean we don't keep trying. That doesn't mean we don't build bigger fences. That doesn't mean we try to find more food. That doesn't mean that we try to put them in a better place of rest. We don't want to just abandon hope and say, well, they're going to choose what they're going to do anyway, so I'm not going to do anything. That is not the answer. I trust that you know that. Here's a number for you. 40 to 50%. Probably you've heard this number before. 40 to 50%. That is the number of youth group kids who are involved in a youth group that will leave their faith in their early 20s. 40 to 50%. What's kind of, here's another number. Of that 40 or 50%, 20% of them plan to leave the youth group. 20% plan to leave the youth group. I don't know if that's scary or the statistic that I'll share next is scary, but so we've got 10 kids, hypothetically, 10 kids. Let's just say, for easy math, 50% of them leave the church, leave their faith. Of that 50%, so of that 20% of them, so one of them planned on doing that. And so we've got 70-ish kids involved in our 7th through 12th grade. And so if you think about it like this, it puts it in a little bit better perspective. Actually, let's think about it as graduating seniors. We have about 10 on average in each class. Some classes are bigger, some are smaller. So that means already one of our high school seniors is planning to leave the church. Statistically, of course, one of our kids is planning to leave the church. In each class, that is the statistic. One kid is planning on leaving the church. They're planning on not having anything to do with their faith once they leave your home. I don't know if that's scarier or if this is scarier. Of the 40 to 50%, just basic logic, 80% of the ones that left didn't plan to do it. 80% of the ones didn't plan to leave the church or their faith, but they did. I know every time I talk about this with parents and with other youth ministers, and really just anyone, they always say, well, college is a time of experimentation, right? And not saying that they should go and experiment with sin, but college is a time where they really are starting to make decisions on a different scale than they've ever done before, right? So it makes sense that you're going to make the wrong decisions, right? I imagine if we were going to take a vote, a lot of us would say, yeah, I made some dumb decisions when I was in college, right? I made decisions that I don't think God would have been happy with. We still make decisions like that, even today. Even this past week, we make decisions that God wouldn't be happy with. I'll say this, and I'm not trying to condone what goes on in college or what goes on in the faith of a lot of young 20s, but people are going to mess up. They're going to try different things. They're going to do things that maybe mom and dad are not happy with, and some of that they need to learn. You know, it's kind of like, so I've got a dog now. I don't know if you know that. I got a dog. He's 10 weeks old. And for the most part, you know, we're not going to let him go play out in the street, right? Because he could die. But there are times where he's walking right by the pool, and I could make sure he doesn't jump in the pool, and he can't swim yet. At least I don't think he can. Or I could let him fall in there. Now, I'm not going to let him drown. I'm going to be there if something happens. I'm going to be there to make sure that he's safe. But there are things like that where we let our kids fail, right? I remember when I was in high school, I had my eye on this girl. She was bad news. I mean, not like bad news, but my mom knew that she wasn't, you know, I guess worth my time or whatever. I guess what girl's worth your time at 15 years old? And I remember, so, you know, she let me make that decision, and so we started dating. And anyways, nothing bad happened, and, you know, we broke up like 3 months later or something like that. I don't know. And I remember a couple years later, I was like, I was just so dumb for dating her. Like, you know, she wasn't like a bad girl, but she wasn't good for my reputation. She wasn't good for my grades, wasn't good for sports. And she, you know, consumed all of my focus and all of my thoughts there in that time. And a couple years later, I was talking to my mom about it. You know, I was past the awkward stage of like, I can't talk to my parents about this. And I was like, why did you let me do that? And I was like, well, and she's, as you know, said, well, you would have done it anyways, for one. But also, you have to learn. You have to learn some things you have to learn the hard way, right? Some things you have to learn trial and error. I say that just to say that we can't dictate what our kids do once they start to get older. And I don't know what that gap is. Do you let a 12th grader decide if they're going to Bible class? Do you let that's not for me to decide. But you can't show up to your kid's dorm at 8 a.m. in college and demand to go to the church. That's not going to work. And so I say that to say sometimes they're going to have to fail. Sometimes they're going to have to do some things wrong in order to learn that the life that we live as Christians really is the best life to live. Here's another statistic. Of the 40 to 50% that left, here, this is a little bit more encouraging. 30 to 60% came back later on in their 20s. So of the 30 to 60%, of the half of them that left, about half of them came back. And so that's a little bit more encouraging. That kind of, I guess supports the idea that, you know, college is a little bit about experimenting and failing and succeeding. But I'm not happy with half of them coming back that had left. To put that in a little bit of perspective, here's our hypothetical 10 graduated seniors. Here's the ones that quit church, quit their faith during college. And by the way, I get that determining whether someone has a faith or is keeping that faith, that's very subjective, right? I don't know really how to exactly define that. I don't know if you know exactly how to define that. Does a kid still have their faith if, you know, maybe they don't go to church, but they pray before a test? I would say probably not, right? But so that is a little bit suggestion. So, but anyway, statistically, half of them will quit going to church. Half of them will quit their faith. A little bit more encouraging, though. Half of those that left will come back. So this will be the amount that come back. That means best case scenario, 70% remain faithful and or come back to their faith. 70%. I guess you could say, let's just throw out the number 30. At the age of 30, 7 of our 10 seniors who graduated in 2018 will come back to the church. Not necessarily Bollywood, but the church. That's best case scenario. I'm not happy with best case scenario. To put that in a little bit more personal terms, here's 10 of our 7th through 12th graders. You want to pick 5 that won't be here or be faithful when they're in college? You want to pick 3 that won't be faithful when they're 25, 30, 35? I don't want to do that. I'm not happy with best case scenario. Let's talk a little bit about the transition after high school. By the way, this is not all going to be about college and all that. But college is, we're kind of preparing them for that, right? And so we're not going to focus on college. We're probably focusing more on it today than we will the rest of the quarter. All of the things that we will discuss are as applicable to a 3rd grader as they are a 12th grader. So here are little things about college. Sex, drugs, alcohol, and partying with some, that's supposed to be studying thrown in here or there. Styling, I guess you could say that. I don't know how you want to. I wasn't very stylish in college. But and obviously the scene that you see in movies and on TV, and if you watch, if you listen to music and watch all these shows centered around college life, it's definitely very exaggerated. They're not doing it every night of the week, but if you go to a college town, and I don't know, who do we have in the medical profession in here? Any nurses or anybody? I know Andrew. Oh yeah, so I bet Troy could probably attest to this. And I read in this book, and it says every college town, every hospital that's close to a college, they stock up on blood for drunk driving accidents. They stock up on IVs for dehydrated alcoholics, and they stock up, and I don't even know what is involved in this, but they also stock up on rape kits on Thursday night because of what goes on a typical college campus. And so the college atmosphere does make a big difference in what people are doing. Also, I want to say, sex, drugs, alcohol consumption, they're not the ultimate litmus test for spirituality. People are going to mess up. And so just because someone had sex does not mean that their faith is destroyed. Just because someone got drunk on a Friday night does not mean that their faith and that Jesus has abandoned them altogether. But I do think it's probably fair to say that these behaviors and partying behaviors are not contributing to a faith that's healthy or a faith that sticks. I think we could probably all agree with that. 50% of college students binge drink on alcohol or drugs at least once a month. 50% do it at least once a month. And that's costing students a lot. Literally, it's costing them a lot. $5.5 billion are spent on alcohol on college campuses, on or around college campuses. $5.5 billion. That is more than college students pay for books, groceries, and gas put together, which maybe it's not that surprising because they don't have any money to spend on that stuff because I guess they spend it all on alcohol. There's a study by the New York University. They did a study on hooking up, which is having sex with someone that you don't intend on having any emotional attachment to. So not having sex with your boyfriend or girlfriend, but just having sex at a party, basically. Virtually all hooking up is lubricated with copious amounts of alcohol. And so maybe we think, well, alcohol is maybe not the worst thing in the world. But virtually all hooking up, having sex outside of marriage with someone you have no emotional attachment to, almost in every case it is because of alcohol. And so then you're thinking about the stepping stones, the slippery slope. But there's a little bit of good news. Here's some thoughts about the Christian in college. So that last slide was just the average college student. The good news is studies show students who are more religious / churchgoers are less likely, by the way, less likely, not unlikely, but less likely to participate in party behaviors. When asked, and when there's a study done, and when asked why they do it, peer pressure, everybody does it. And probably not going to surprise us again. But a lot of students said it's hard to make any friends if you don't do it. And you know, as we probably know, they're probably not getting there on a Tuesday and binge drinking on a Wednesday, but maybe they go to a party and they have one on Thursday. And then that becomes more, and that becomes more, and that becomes more, and eventually they're in that pattern of binge drinking on a regular behavior, which then obviously leads to a lot of other behaviors that would not be helpful. I just thought this was interesting. Key decisions about the behavior that you're going to make in any situation, but especially kids going into college, but this goes for kids going back to school, goes for adults switching jobs, switching any aspect of life. Key decisions are made in the first 2 weeks. Key decisions are made in the first 2 weeks. I want to elaborate on that, but I thought that was interesting. So here's where I want us to discuss a little bit. This is, according to the book, they needed to know, how do you define sticky faith? If you're going to do this research on who's faithful, you have to have a constant, right? You have to be able to say, well, what is sticky faith? So these are the three things that they determined is faith, is sticky faith. One, it's both internal and external. Internal and external. What do you think it means by internal faith? What is internal faith? Or let's think about it this way. What do you want your team to know internally about God and their faith and their salvation?
That they're loved.
That they're loved?
It's never too late to ask for forgiveness.
Never too late to ask for forgiveness. Yeah, I have my best man in my wedding, his brother, for probably close to 10 years. He's the older brother. He'd done a lot of really bad things. He'd stolen from his parents. He had just done a lot of bad things, and he just thought, I can't get forgiveness. I've done too many things wrong. Thankfully, happy ending to that story. He's now a restored member of the church. But for 10 years, he never asked for forgiveness because he didn't think he was worthy of it. A lot of things could happen in 10 years. So yeah, we want them to forgiveness, yes. Love, yes. What else? Internally.
God's ways are better than the world's ways.
Yeah.
No matter how good the world makes it seem, God's ways are there for a reason.
Yeah.
Choose that.
You know, Katie, she's studying mental health counseling right now, and so a lot of her focus, because of our ministry, is adolescent girls, and she does counseling with I guess anybody, but that's her focus. And you know, it seems like every case that she had, almost every case, stems from people not doing God's way. Girls that were abused when they were younger, parents who are neglecting their children, kids at school who are bullying girls and guys. They're not following God's way, you know, Satan makes sin and Satan makes these behavior look like they're very rewarding. We talked a couple weeks ago about how Satan is a great illusionist, right? You go to a magic show and they make you believe that has got to be magic, right? There's no way possible that could be real. The illusionist makes your mind believe that what you're seeing is real. That's kind of what Satan does too, right? He makes it look as if, oh, money, that makes people happy, right? Because you see people on a boat and they look happy, right? You don't see what happens when they go home at night. You see people that got all these great things. You think, oh, that's what makes us happy. Satan does that. So yeah, we want our teens to know that God's way really is the best. Well, what about externally? What do you want them? So internally, yeah, we want to know that they're loved. We want them to know that forgiveness is always available to the Christian. Even though it's always available for everybody, right? And we want them to know that God's way is best. We want them to internalize these things, to really believe, kind of be at the core of who they are. And then we know Jesus talks about what's in the heart proceeds, right, outward. So what externally, what does it look like when a teen knows they're loved, when they know they can get forgiveness, when they know God's way is best? What externally do they do to manifest that?
They have courage to stand up for their beliefs
Yeah.
and give those things to
Do what? Yeah, they want to be here. You know, they want to be here, but they also want to be here physically, right? Yeah. This is, I didn't prepare to say this, but I was talking to someone recently, and I don't want to suggest that this was an excuse. My mind thinks it is, but I don't want to. But they've given up on organized religion, which basically, in my mind, I think they don't want to go to church. And maybe not. I know some people really do have an issue with that, but you know, the church was organized in the New Testament, and if you believe in God and you love God, wouldn't you want to be with people like that? Anyways, so yeah, we want kids to know internally. We want their faith to be internal and external. What about personal and communal? Personal and communal. And I guess Lee kind of touched on that. I'll be honest. Personal for me is much harder than communal. Personal for me is much harder than communal. A lot of times, at the end of a day, usually Sunday or Wednesday, I think, you know, am I doing this because it's my job or because I trust in God and I believe in this? And I do trust in God and believe in this. But it's easy for me to get wrapped up in making sure everybody else has faith in God, make sure everybody else is doing the right thing, and make sure everybody else has a good prayer life, and make sure everybody else has all these things. But I need to be personally just as committed. You know, I wonder if I was put in a place where I didn't know anybody and nobody knew what my religious life would look like. We want our kids' faith to be personal, where no matter where they go in the world, that they're going to stick with God. But the church is communal, right? They gather daily together to break bread, to study, to be together. Then thirdly, a sticky faith is mature. We want our kids to have a faith that is mature, right? We all want that, personally and for our teens. But also we need to understand that a 17-year-old's faith is not going to be the same as a 28-year-old's faith, or a 45-year-old's faith, or a 7-year-old's faith, right? So we need to understand that their faith is going to continue to mature over time. So when students go to college, or really not even college, when students step out of this building and they step out of your homes, they have all these decisions and all these choices when they're thinking about college, when they're thinking about what classes they're going to take next year in high school, when they're thinking about if they're going to be on the sports team, if they're going to try cheer, and then on top of that, all just the daily decisions. They have all of these decisions, all of these things that they're trying to fit into their 24-hour day or their 7-day week, right? And so what I think a sticky faith requires is someone sitting down, looking at all these things, looking at their agenda, looking at their goals, looking at their planner, looking at their priorities, looking at their personal life, looking at their to-do list, looking at their friends. They look at all these things, and they've got all these things, and they say, okay, God first. God first. Not football first. Not fans first. Not my grades first. They say, how am I going to make sure that I'm faithful? And parents need to do the same thing. Jody needs to do the same thing. We need to be concerned about these things, obviously, but if we are so much more committed to our kid getting a scholarship than we are our kid remaining faithful, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. If we are so much more committed to our kid making a lot of money when they graduate high school as opposed to being faithful after they graduate college, you're doing it wrong. At least you're doing your faith wrong and instilling that in the child. Those things have to be at the forefront of our decisions. They have to be at the forefront of our mind. And I kind of mentioned this earlier. It's never too early. So I know we've got some middle school parents, and like I said, this is probably the most we'll focus on college and life after they're in your home. But it's never too early to start instilling the things that we're going to discuss. This was really important, or really interesting. This statement is from someone who's not religious. They're not, or they might be religious, but this wasn't necessarily a Christian religious study that happened. But there was a behavioralist that was studying religions, not just Christianity, but religions in general. And one of the things that she noted is most religions want their teens to remain with that religion, right? So if you're a Buddhist, you probably want your kids to remain Buddhist, right? If you're Muslim, you want your kids to remain Muslim. And so no matter which faith you belong to, most parents aren't like, oh yeah, my kid's now a faith worshiper or something like that. So anyway, she was just studying the effects of that, and this is her quote. Given the seeming importance of retaining youth for most religious groups in the United States, it's striking how haphazardly most congregations go about doing it. So this was someone from the outside looking in at religious groups and determining that these religious groups at least said, oh yeah, we want our kids to remain faithful. But then this behavioralist who did this study says, well, it doesn't really look like you're trying to do it. I know most Christian parents want their kids to remain faithful. And I just wonder if someone was looking at what we're doing and what we're instilling, I wonder if they'd say, well, you're doing a haphazard job of instilling that in them. That's not for any of us to judge on any other parents, but that's something to reflect on for yourself. A few things to remember. God is bigger than all these things. As much as I like data and research, God is more important than those things. And God is bigger than those things. God can beat the 70%. God is capable of doing that. A few verses and then we'll end with these. But Jesus looked at them and said, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. I know maybe sometimes, I think this sometimes with people, but I think there's just no way, right? Like they're so focused on other things. There's no way that they could put God at the forefront. There's no way that they're going to be able to make the decisions that they need to make. Maybe sometimes you feel like that as parents. Well, with you only, yeah, that might be the case, but we need to remember that God is on our side. Colossians 3:23 through 24 says, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. I just wonder, I don't guess I know this, but I wonder if sometimes we're more focused on instilling in our kids a way to act so that our peers will think, oh wow, their kids act really good. I hope your kids act really good, but acting really good is not necessarily as important. And by the way, we all have different ideas of what acting good might be too. We don't need to be training our kids to please other parents or to please other people. I'm not saying we shouldn't take those things into consideration, but we need to do this for the Lord, right? We're not training kids so that the youth minister can have well-trained kids. I wouldn't object to that. You're not training kids so that your neighbor will look at you and like, wow, they're just doing something right. I hope they say that. But we're doing this for the Lord, and we need to do this as if we are doing it for the Lord. And this is really interesting, a really interesting passage. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with parenting like human father-son to human kid, but it does talk about God's relationship to us as children. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 7, it's actually 7 through 11. It says, it is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us and respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, this is the part that struck me. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. God, I think, does a lot of things and puts a lot of things in our life as far as discipline goes, and we don't like it at first, right? We don't like discipline, and maybe we think, maybe we lost our job and we think, why would God do this? Well, maybe, I don't know that God always works this, but I think he works like this sometimes. Maybe he took that job away from you so that you could put something else in place of that. Maybe he took that job away from you so he could give you a better place to minister, to work. Discipline is not something that we always like. It's not always pleasant in the present, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. I think that applies to growing Christian kids. I know, and there are times where I've got the kids and a song on the radio comes on. I know this is so dumb. And I know we probably shouldn't listen to that song, or I know there are some subjective elements in that song, and maybe they don't even realize it's subjective, but they're like, oh, I love this song, and then I've got to be the guy that, right? And then they're all mad at me. And that's really, really simple, I know, compared to a lot of things that y'all have to tackle. And I know that discipline can be very, 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 very difficult sometimes. But remember that I'd much rather have a little bit of pain in the present than sacrifice the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Appreciate y'all's attentiveness. Next week, I think will be, we'll have a lot more discussion and stuff. I know it was a lot of information, but I appreciate y'all being in here, and I hope that this will be an encouraging time for us to fellowship and be together. If you have suggestions over the course of the class, feel free to let me know about them. Y'all have a great worship.
I do need to try to get one of those little just to show me he's teaching, and he's got practice with it in there. Thank you.
Try to refrain from saying things. I don't know if it's worth mentioning on there. If you want to